The Rocky Horror Picture Show is one of the most iconic cult classics of the past 50 years. Chances are you've seen the movie or you've gone to a live show. Hell, I've been in one. But what if I told you that there was an attempt at a follow-up? Something that the creator, Richard O'Brien, would go on record saying, it's not a sequel, it's not a prequel, it's an equal. That's right, today I'm going to tell you the story of the forgotten Rocky Horror sequel, Shock Treatment. Now, before I get into thoughts and opinions on the movie, I think it's really important to understand how this film came to be, and that Shock Treatment is really the third variation of the direct Rocky Horror sequel.
Shock treatment, so look out, mister, don't you blow your last resistor for a vista that'll mystify ya.
3 years after the release of Rocky Horror, the success was apparent, so Richard O'Brien began to work on a direct sequel called Rocky Horror Shows His Heels. Now, the goal of this would have been to bring back the same cast and creative team, and while we don't know a ton about the plot, some of the things we do know is that it would have had the resurrection of Tim Curry's Dr. Frank-N-Furter, would have had a resurrection of Rocky, and would have had a character arc that had Brad becoming gay. In addition, Janet giving birth to Frank-N-Furter's child. Now, the reason this didn't happen is because the director from Rocky Horror, Jim Sharman, was hesitant to do the material because he felt it was too close to the first movie, probably not wanting to rehash old concepts. And Tim Curry didn't want to return.
Well, how about that?
In order to keep them on board, Richard O'Brien began to work on another script called The Brad and Janet Show. Now, O'Brien had already begun to work on music for Rocky Horror Shows His Heels, and he didn't want to lose that work, so he decided to repurpose those songs for The Brad and Janet Show, 8 of which appear in Shock Treatment. The film's plot is super similar to what would eventually become Shock Treatment, but there's a few reasons that The Brad and Janet Show specifically didn't get made. First, Tim Curry. He was asked to play the role of Farley Flavors, which he agreed to, but then Barry Bostwick dropped out, and Curry was asked to play both Flavors and Brad, something he felt like he couldn't do because he said he couldn't do a convincing American accent. Second, the studio couldn't get Susan Sarandon to reprise the role of Janet because she was demanding quite the hefty payday. Now, there's some discrepancy about what the amount is, but it's said to be somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million, which is a lot of money in 1980, and you gotta consider she wasn't a superstar yet. But for a young actress on the rise who had just done a massive hit before, you can't blame her for trying to secure the bag the second time around. And finally, SAG went on strike in 1980. That's the Screen Actors Guild. This would limit both their budget and their shooting possibilities. So in order to accommodate this, someone on the production staff suggested shooting the entire movie to take place on a soundstage. So Richard O'Brien rewrote the script a third time and gave us what was now known as Shock Treatment. No Curry, no Bostwick, no Sarandon, but surely this will work, right? I'll be honest, the film is not a complete disaster. It's a lot of fun, but it does have its flaws. But I think in order to understand that, let's break down the plot first.
Shock treatment, gets you jumping like a real live wire. Need a bit of...
So, you know this is a sequel right away because Brad and Janet are clearly married because it's Brad and Janet Majors now. And they live in a town called Denton, which is inside a television studio for Denton TV. And so you have this opening number, Denton USA, and we see a commercial break for Farley Flavors Fast Food. That's the company that owns Denton TV.
F4, F4, and F4.
And we see their logo, which looks like something. And anyways, the residents of Denton, or the audience, depending on how you view it, honestly, they're either part of the show, or they're part of the audience, or they're part of the production crew. They play some form in the TV shows always.
Oh, you bet, Bert.
Good! I'm gonna be there!
And so Brad and Janet are selected from the audience to participate in a show called Marriage Maze,
Come on, what's cooking up there?
which is hosted by this character that's supposedly blind. His name's Bert Schnick. And Bert kind of eggs Janet on, embarrasses her in front of the whole audience about her and Brad's marital issues. And so he suggests that she sends him to Dentonvale, which is another show that's a mental hospital for treatment. And so she feels the pressure from both Bert and the crowd, and she feels that she has to send Brad, and she does. So after this show, we switch to the show Dentonvale, where we're introduced to brother and sister Cosmo and Nation McKinley, and they're the doctors who run the mental institute.
I'm Dr. Cosmo McKinley, and this is my sister and colleague, Dr. Nation McKinley.
And they take Brad in for treatment, and Janet's asked to sign this contract, which she kind of like puts off for later. So we cut back to Marriage Maze, and Bert is now quizzing Janet's parents about Brad's mental instability. And this is where we learn that Brad's an orphan, and they believe that's a cause for the way he is. And so they win a stay on a series called Happy Homes. So Janet then visits her parents on the set of Happy Homes, you know, as a guest star, where her mother dresses her to look a lot like Deb from Napoleon Dynamite. And you know, not a whole lot happens in the scene besides Janet's dad singing one of the most head-scratching songs in the movie, Thank God I'm a Man. And so then Janet appears again on Dentonvale. This time she's asking to see Brad, and she's denied, and instead she's introduced to Farley Flavors via a televised message. And he's the owner of Denton TV, and he sings this song where he talks about his dream of marrying the girl next door. And she's clearly charmed by his presentation. And so Cosmo and Nation begin to lie to Janet, say that Brad's begun to hate her and resent her, and the only solution is becoming a star.
Oh, if only Brad could have found it within himself.
And so she's given this complete makeover that transforms her personality in the process to be more outgoing. And so she's reintroduced to Denton TV audiences with her song Me of Me, which really sees Janet coming into her own. And we also see Farley add a supreme level of horniness at the sight of a woman holding a guitar. So Janet's parents have this breakthrough, and they realize how manipulative Denton TV is, so they try and get Brad released, but then they're quickly roped back into the shenanigans through the song Shock Treatment. So Janet begins to develop this ugly ego as a result of her star power, and so Cosmo and Nation drug her to kind of tame her and secure cooperation in the plan.
I think you need a little rest.
So the next show, Faith Factory, is preparing to air, and this is going to be the show where it's expected that Farley's going to marry this severely drugged Janet. And so shortly before the show goes live, Betty Hapschatt discovers that Cosmo and Nation aren't real doctors, but they're just character actors. She also discovers that Farley and Brad are long-lost twin brothers, so she informs another character, Judge Oliver Wright, that they need to go free Brad while the show's being introduced.
A ridiculous accusation. You force me to refuse her.
So Brad interrupts the show, and he confronts his brother telepathically with the song Duet Duel.
You're a loser, an abomination in the eyes of any sensitive man.
After this, Janet takes back Brad, and they're both exiled from Denton TV, where they escape using a prized car. And while this is going on, Farley convinces the entire Denton TV audience to follow him into Dentonvale, where they're all going to be institutionalized. So that's the plot of Shock Treatment, and if that's a little bit dense for you, here's a quick recap I came up with. Hey there, brother, how's it going? That's a nice wife you got there. Oh, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate that. I'm gonna fuck her. I'm sorry, what? That's the movie, and now that you have an idea of kind of what the development process was like and what the plot is, now I think I can break it down more cohesively for you.
Shock treatment gets you jumping like a real live wire. Need a bit of shock treatment.
First, let me just say I really don't think it's a bad movie. I think it's a lot of fun. It's definitely flawed, so let's break down kind of what works and what doesn't for me. First, I think that by retaining the creative team and some of the supporting cast, you know, they really did kind of capture a lot of the essence of Rocky, from the music to the feel to the sound even a little bit. You know, Rocky kind of takes you somewhere else. It makes you feel like you're somewhere very foreign. This movie kind of makes you feel like you're in some weird alternate reality. And I think that works in the film's favor. And there's also some really beautiful songs. You know, I think Lullaby visually is a lot of fun to look at. Looking at a Trade is another big highlight for me. It's just a lot of fun to watch those specific songs. I think even though that they used different actors for Brad and Janet, and that was kind of off-putting, I think Jessica Harper, the actress who played Janet, really crushed it. You know, I thought Janet was so dynamic in this movie. Like, her character arc was super interesting. And I thought Harper really maximized it. Even though her approach and her voice are entirely different from Susan Sarandon, it's a welcome change, honestly. You know, I thought she crushed her songs. I thought it was memorable in the best ways. And I thought she was like charming and empathetic when she needed to be. And then she could be really off-putting when the story demanded it. So I just thought that was a really impressive performance. Cliff DeYoung plays Brad in Farley Flavors, and you know, he's not the most compelling Brad, but I really like the work he did with Farley Flavors. I think maybe the most interesting element of this film is the way ahead of its time kind of prediction of reality TV and how it blurs the lines of what's real and what's not, and how reality TV isn't really all that real. They're kind of manufactured storylines. Sometimes corporations, you know, play a factor in it. You know, when we're in the Happy Home segment, almost every single item that the parents are using are being advertised in real time. So it really blurs the lines between what's real and what's not. And then way ahead of its time in 1980, it kind of lightly touches on the issue of the impact of how reality TV can make society look, how that can impact one individual's mental health, which I think is just so cool and so ahead of its time. I'm not gonna lie and tell you that these characters are better than the ones in Rocky. They're not. They're really not as memorable, but I will say I think the characters have more arc in this movie. I think they service the plot more. You know, there's not a whole lot of characters that feel completely unimportant. You know, I think Janet's parents aren't entirely necessary, but everybody else services the plot a lot. There's 3 songs in this movie that I really came away with a genuine love for. The first is the title song, Shock Treatment. This is clearly the fun party song of the movie. It really showcases the supporting cast's like vocal ability and range, much in the way that Time Warp did. You know, it's not as catchy, but it really does kind of showcase them in a fun way. The second song is Me of Me, which is Janet's coming out song, and it sounds really fun. It's kind of like something out of the late 70s disco era. But it's also the song that I think services the plot the most. This is where Janet has really bought into the new personality, the new idea of being a star, and it's kind of the coming out song, if you will. My third favorite song is Looking for a Trade. This is my favorite moment of the movie. Honestly, it's so much fun to look at visually. It's super cool, and it's got like this kind of cool chunky bass riff, and the sound, it's so different from every other song in the movie, you know what I mean? So Janet is like tripping on the drugs in this movie, she's kind of like looped out, and this song feels like a fever dream, and it's where I felt like kind of the aesthetic along with the look and feel and the sound, it was just all perfectly blended in this movie.
Looking for trade. I need some young blood.
Alright, now I want to talk about what didn't work, and this isn't going to be just a complete bashing session, but let's start with the obvious. This isn't Brad and Janet, and I'm not talking about the actors or their approach, I'm talking about the characters and the way they're written. They're completely different from Rocky Horror. These feel like different people all together, and I think like the big thing is this is clearly a sequel because they're married now, and their names are Brad and Janet Majors, which implies that they're married now, but there's no recollection or reference to the events of Rocky Horror. Supposedly the events of Rocky Horror are not canon in this, but the problem is they never tell you that. They never tell you that. So it kind of poses the question, why would you alienate the thing you know the crowd loves? The crowd came to this movie because it's a Rocky Horror sequel. It's Brad and Janet's story, but there's no real continuation of story. It's like the definition of a spinoff. I think second, the plot, there's a lot going on. It's really, really, really hard to follow the first time around. They throw a lot at you, especially in the beginning. I think the subplot of Betsy and Judge Wright kind of doing this investigation, it was totally lost to me the first time. It's very confusing. And then Janet's parents, their whole thing, the first time it felt really unnecessary to me. The second time, I didn't feel it was completely unnecessary, but I didn't feel like it was fully justified either. Another big element for me in this movie is the unnecessary sexuality. Alright? So Rocky Horror is jam-packed with sexuality and raunchy behavior, but it's justified. You know what I mean? Because it services the plot. You know, you have Frankenfurter trying to create the perfect man because he's so sexually driven. They live on transsexual Transylvania. Like, it works. You know what I mean? In this film, it's just kind of haphazardly thrown in there. It doesn't really service the plot at all. There's this weird moment where Janet, she like falls asleep after being drugged and the lemon slice from the glass falls between her legs and Nation eats it. Like, what the fuck? Also, do we need to address the implied incest?
Romance is not a children's game.
Yes? No? Maybe? Okay. And now for this part. This may be the biggest problem, and I'm going to refer to my notes right here because I don't want to get this wrong. This film, at times, is openly racist, sexist, and homophobic. I mean, from the very first opening lyrics, they talk about how in Dentonville, there's tolerance for the ethnic races. It's just very off-putting. There's another part where in the Happy Home scene, we learn about Janet's dad hating Mexicans, which has nothing to do with the plot, so why bring it up? Why do we need to know that? And then there's this random line.
Alimony is just another word for rape.
And those are just a few small examples. But the bulk of the issue comes with Janet's dad's song, Thank God I'm a Man. This song, he's kind of singing about these toxic ideas of what the perfect man is. And it's toxic as hell, but the worst line, and I wrote it down. Janet's dad, he rhymes maggots with a slur for gay people, and he's referring to them as such. And it's such a head scratcher of a lyric to come from Richard O'Brien when you know that Rocky Horror plays such a big role in the LGBTQ community. So why would you do that? Like, why would you kind of have such harsh words for your audience to hear? I don't think it was justified, in my opinion. Now I want to talk about the music because I think with the exception of Reprises, no two songs sound the same. And if you make that same argument for Rocky, I'll counter and say that the music, at the very least, seems specific to the character singing them. And I think a good musical will have a consistent sound and really kind of vary when it's a distinct, different character or if they're presenting a new idea. This is something I think Hamilton does a good job of. You know, like King George's character sounds entirely different from the other characters in the show. It's distinct to him. The other factor of the music equation is that a lot of these songs just flat out seem unnecessary. I get Richard O'Brien, he didn't want to lose the songs he worked on for Rocky Horror Shows His Heels. But with Rocky Horror, every single song moves the plot along in some fashion. You can't take a song out of that show because then you'll be missing some of the story. Whereas with this musical, I think you can take quite a few out. I think he did a good job repurposing some of the songs, but I think a lot of them are unnecessary. Like, I would say, Thank God I'm a Man. Obviously, we didn't need that. We didn't need a Lullaby, which is really fun to watch, but like it doesn't push the plot along. And then Bitchin' in the Kitchen. Like, did we really need a song about kitchen appliances? Really? And like, I've heard some speculation that it's talking about the kind of value that we give tangible but unimportant objects. And like, yeah, if you want to make that argument, you can, but on the surface, it's just Brad singing about, you know, kind of toasters and percolators, and we didn't really need it. Also, one final critique. There was no shock treatment in the movie. There was a song about shock treatment, but nowhere in the movie is there any other mention of shock treatment We don't see any shock treatment. It doesn't exist. So I've talked about what worked for me, what didn't work for me, but what do I think could have made this film better objectively? Let's get into it. Let me start with the obvious, Brad and Janet. This didn't need to be Brad and Janet's story, right? They're completely different from Rocky, and I understand it's not supposed to be canon, but look, this could have been any married couple, and it would have been just as interesting. I think the character arc with Janet would have stood on its own fine. It's super interesting, it's very fascinating, it's very dynamic. But if it's going to be Brad and Janet's story, and if you're going to use different actors, go out of your way to establish that this is either a multiverse or a parallel universe, and I think we'll buy the idea easier that this is different. Don't regard the events of Rocky. This is still Brad and Janet, but they're different in a way. And then I think you also open the door for more spin-offs, which, can you imagine if we had more Rocky Horror spin-offs done well? You know what I mean? All right, secondly, I think this film could have largely benefited if Richard O'Brien had just cut his losses with the music. You know, not try and repurpose everything. And I think Thank God I'm a Man is a really, really good example of this. It didn't work in shock treatment. But if we go back to Rocky Horror Shows His Heels and we think about that Brad was supposed to become gay in that movie, and I think that, oh, this song was probably intended for Barry Bostwick as Brad. And then I think it's possible that this song could have been about Brad struggling to come to terms with his sexuality, that he was trying to reinforce all these toxic male ideas that he grew up with by singing these songs. And then that way, the homophobic lyrics are justified in a way because they're through the lens of a character having an internal struggle. And then I think that song holds so much more weight and it's so necessary to the story, but instead, it's just kind of thrown in there and it's really kind of harsh on the ears. All right, third, this film has some funny moments, but not a lot. Rocky Horror has so much comedy and raunchiness. That's part of why it's so charming. This film just kind of dips its toes in it, and it really should have gone head first. It kind of felt like it didn't know what it wanted to be, you know? So those are the three things that I felt like could have made this film better. You know, I know they're kind of general blanket things, but they're honestly the biggest holes with the movie. So those are my thoughts on shock treatment. It's flawed, but it's fun. And I hope I didn't steer you away from watching it. You can watch it for free on YouTube. And I think you just got to go in and tell yourself, this isn't a Rocky Horror sequel. Just take it for what it is. It's a fun, wacky ride, and it has a really interesting perspective on the impact of reality TV on society. So if you like this video, and if you want to see more videos of me kind of talking about forgotten movies like this, I'll definitely do it. Just make sure you like, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.
Playing doctor and nurse, it can be good for your health. I've seen clinics with those gimmicks in Tangiers. But if you open your